He's about to be involved in an accident which could easily have been avoided. An accident that a risk assessment could have prevented. Risk assessments save lives. They could save yours. This film will show you how to avoid an accident like the one that Armando suffered. You'll see that a risk assessment is essential for any hot work on board, even for minor jobs. In our first film on risk assessment, we looked at how you should think of risk assessment as a continuous process, as an ongoing part of your work on board, and not just as a paperwork exercise. In this film, we're going to highlight the more formal risk assessment process. In particular, we'll focus on how it can prevent accidents when you or your colleagues are about to carry out any hot work on board. This film applies to you, whether you're an officer preparing a written risk assessment or an AB about to use a welding torch. We all need to understand how a risk assessment works, but perhaps more importantly, we need to understand why it works. So, let's begin Armando's story. Armando's ship was lying at anchor while cargo operations were being carried out. The chief engineer had several maintenance jobs planned, one of which was to clean the main engine exhaust boiler. After the cleaning, they had to drain the dirty water from the boiler into empty oil drums. There were 2 empty drums standing by, with their tops cut off, using the safe cold cutting method of a hammer and cold chisel. The 2 drums were quickly filled, and it became clear that another was needed. The 3rd drum was still intact, and instead of removing its top, they unscrewed the cap and poured in the remaining dirty water. With the cap back on again, they left all 3 drums to settle in the warm engine room as the ship set sail. The scene was set for an horrific accident. Why? Well, the 3rd drum hadn't been cleaned out. It contained both residue from its original contents and also the dirty, oily water from the boiler cleaning work. As we all know, oil floats on water. As the level of the dirty water rose, so did the oil residue, till it was near the top of the drum. Another well-known characteristic of oil is that it gives off a combustible vapour, a flammable gas. And of course, if heated, a flammable gas will explode. Left to stand in the warm engine room, the trapped vapour slowly built up above the liquid at the top of the drum. This drum had become a serious hazard. On any ship, hazards and risks are everywhere. A risk assessment is designed to give you sufficient time to identify these hazards, enabling you to eliminate the dangers in your everyday working environment.
I believe when working on a ship in a hazardous environment, before you carry out any hazardous task, it's essential to carry out a risk assessment. This way, you can identify any hazards associated with the work.
So, let's look at a formal risk assessment. In particular, we'll identify how it can help prevent accidents when you or your colleagues perform hot work. It's worth noting that a formal risk assessment is a legal requirement on board a ship, as it is in many other industries. The exact regulation varies depending upon the flag state, but the UK MCA, for example, says in their Code of Safe Working Practice,
employers are required to ensure the health and safety of workers and other persons so far as possible by the application of certain principles, including the evaluation of unavoidable risks and the taking of action to reduce them.
In short, a risk assessment is not a matter of choice, it's a legal requirement. And as it might be you that carries out this risk assessment, applying the lessons you learn in this film could help prevent serious injury, perhaps even saving a life, maybe your own.
It makes me feel safer knowing that through a risk assessment, control measures are in place, and I know that I can get on with my job, as well as my friends that are undertaking the job with me, and I know we're going to be safe.
But there's another reason for carrying out a risk assessment. The very process of carrying out a risk assessment provides a moment of reflection. It's our thinking time, if you like. The time to think about the potential hazards contained in the task we're about to do before we actually do it. It's far better to think, what if, before it becomes, what happened? So, as well as the legal requirement to perform a risk assessment, there's also what might be called the common sense reason. For a risk assessment to be of any practical use, we need to know how to do it, having discovered why we do it. But above all, we need to carry out the process in a thorough and professional manner. Always remember the common sense element. Take a look at the job. Stop and think about it before you start. Okay, so what exactly is the procedure for carrying out a proper risk assessment? The UK Code says,
The intention is that the process should be simple but meaningful.
Put very simply, a risk assessment is the process that enables us to identify the hazards in the job we're about to undertake, estimate the risk of the identified hazards, and to then take steps to control or eliminate the risks involved. You might like to think about the terms hazard and risk. They're quite different. A hazard is a source of danger or harm. For example, our drum is an explosion hazard because it contains flammable vapour. If there are no hazards involved with our task, very unlikely where hot work is concerned, then we're free to start work. For a hot task, we'll be thinking about hazards such as fire, explosion, toxic fumes, burns, heat transmission, and so on. A risk is the likelihood that the hazard will occur, combined with the consequences of it happening. The risk of an explosion from the vapour in our drum is very high, and the consequences could be severe. So, we need to eliminate or control the risk. Our risk assessment will identify the hazards in the work we're about to do and the risk that these hazards present. Carrying out the risk assessment has made us stop and think about the hazards and risks, the what-ifs, and that will help us to minimise those risks. For hot work, it means producing a hot work permit, which will detail the precautions which need to be taken to make sure the job can be done safely. This formal risk assessment should be carried out by a suitably qualified and experienced person, usually a senior ship's officer. But don't forget that everyone can carry out a simple risk assessment themselves before carrying out a job. Any job. Stop. Look at the job and think about it. If it looks dangerous or you can see a problem, stop and do something about it. Let's return to Armando and see how a risk assessment, together with a hot work permit we talked about, would have prevented his accident.
After 24 hours at sea, the weather abated and movement of the vessel eased. At an 8 a.m. meeting, the second engineer told Armando and the two cadets to begin transferring the water from the drums to the bilge tanks, filtering it to keep any oily deposits out of the bilge water. The second engineer did not consider that a risk assessment was necessary, and no hot work permit was issued. He simply didn't expect that any hot work would take place. The work proceeded smoothly while they emptied the two open-top drums, filtering the waste and pouring the water into the bilge tank. But they had a problem with the third drum. It still had its top attached, so they couldn't drain it. Armando decided to cut the top off the drum, but he didn't stop to think about what he was doing. He chose a method that he considered quick and easy, an angle grinder. He didn't take the time to think about the hazard or the risk it presented. He also broke the rules. Using an angle grinder is hot work, for which a risk assessment and a hot work permit were always required. The two cadets could have challenged him, but they didn't. It's possible that they didn't appreciate that the contents of the drum, what may have seemed like harmless grey water, posed a hazard. When the job changed, the work should have stopped, and the situation been reassessed. A risk assessment would have provided Armando and his colleagues with their thinking time, the time when they could look for and think about the hazards and risks involved. None of those involved appreciated the risk in what Armando was about to do. That's precisely why there are rules about hot work carried out on board. As on most vessels, a hot work permit is required for any hot work outside the engine room. however trivial the task appears to be. There's a good reason for this. A permit to work can only be issued after a risk assessment has been carried out. The risk assessment would have identified the hazard of a flammable vapour in the drum, and that the risk from this was both highly likely and could have severe consequences. The risk controls put in place might have said that the cap should be removed from the drum to allow the vapour to escape, and as a further precaution, only a cold method should be used to cut the top off the drum, reducing the risk of explosion. So, a risk assessment and the risk controls that resulted from it could easily have prevented this tragedy.
OK, now you're going to talk amongst yourselves. Yes, I'd like you to discuss with your colleagues the hazards associated with hot work. See how many potential hazards you can identify. OK, pause this programme now and start it again when you've talked it through. OK, how did you do? Let's pick up some of the hazards you probably identified. Fire. There's the obvious and immediate risk of fire in the work area itself, around the work area, or on clothing or materials. Explosion. Are there likely to be any flammable vapours, either in the work area or in adjacent spaces? Could pipes contain a flammable liquid or vapour, possibly under pressure? Smouldering. The risk of a fire breaking out after you've left the work area, or on the other side of a bulkhead, down hatchways or hold ventilators. Fumes generated by the work. Burns, either to yourself or to others. Equipment. Is the equipment you're about to use safe? You might like to discuss amongst yourselves afterwards any other kinds of hazard you can think of. Remember, the purpose of a risk assessment is to identify the hazards associated with a task we're about to carry out, allowing us to then identify means of controlling the risks arising from these hazards. For the incident we've been following in this film, a risk assessment would have revealed the hazard of a flammable vapour inside the drum, that the risk of explosion was very high, and the consequences severe. The risk assessment would have identified that an angle grinder was not a suitable method for removing the top of the drum, and a cold method should have been used. OK, let's try one more thing. Think about another hot work scenario, welding a fitting to a bulkhead, for example. What hazards might your risk assessment consider, and what measures would you take to eliminate the risks associated with them? Pause the programme again and see what you can think of. OK, right, here are some ideas you may have picked up. Fire. Clear away any flammable material around the work area. Appoint a fire marshal. Check behind and above, below bulkheads. Explosion. Test the local atmosphere regularly with a combustible gas detector. You may also need to test the atmosphere in adjacent spaces. Smouldering. Return to the work area frequently after the work is completed until you're sure there's no further risk of fire breaking out. Fumes. Ensure adequate ventilation in the work area. Burns. Make sure you and others are wearing the correct PPE and that it's in good condition. Equipment safety. Is the work equipment safe? Has it been confirmed as safe by a suitably qualified person? Before carrying out this type of job, make sure you know what lies on the other side of the bulkhead. It might well be the engine room, a hold containing cargo, or cables or pipes that may be affected by heat. If welding is carried out around the base of a bulkhead, there could be a fuel tank directly below or a void space in the vicinity. The hot work permit for your task should cover all the above precautions and is your guide to completing the job safely. Read it and follow it. Right. Now we're about to see very clearly what can happen if these rules are not applied, even for a seemingly minor job. Armando was under pressure now. With the other two drums drained, he felt he should get the last drum cleared as soon as possible. Looking for the quickest way to remove the top of the drum, Armando reached for the angle grinder and started it up. Nobody was paying any attention to what he was doing, even though the other cadets themselves were in danger. The cadets ran to help Armando, who was lying next to the drum, seriously injured. Sadly, Armando died on board shortly afterwards, before the ship could return to port. Tragically, this accident was completely avoidable. Armando would still be alive today if only they had performed a risk assessment.
It's essential that you know and understand the Safety Management System, SMS, requirements on board your ship for hot work. Where these differ from the content of this training film, the SMS should always be followed. Remember, risk assessments really do save lives, and the life they save could be yours.